Welcome all to the March 14th edition of the Iamblichus Reading Group. I'm very grateful to be joined by Farzana and Ryan tonight. In this episode, we discuss the great philosopher Plato's theories of divine mania. As Farzana says, mania has a negative connotation, so we should use the word rapture, which scholars also agree on. Plato identifies four types of divine rapture: erotic, telastic, prophetic, and poetic. Much of tonight's discussion is about the fascinating topic of erotic rapture, but we also begin to discuss prophetic rapture as well. So join us as we continue reading Iamblichus's Egyptian Mysteries. Everyone, welcome to the Thursday, March 14th edition of the Iamblichus Reading Group. Tonight, another short crew with Ryan and myself, and we're still working on Iamblichus's discussion of possession and rapture. Last time we talked a little bit about possession and some of the experiences that we've had. I think, Ryan, you wanted to maybe step back a few steps and take up the Platonic notions of mania, or also known as rapture. Those include the erotic, the telastic, the prophetic, and the poetic. I think that, I don't have anything written for tonight, but I think we can take that up as and then a little bit after we discuss those four types of rapture, we can get into some passages within the reading for tonight and look at what we think about those.
Cool.
So,
sounds great.
I think that when it comes to rapture, as far as erotic, I think most of us are probably, familiar with that, maybe to varying degrees. There are
Tangentially, at the very least.
Yeah. I think there are those who say that they're asexual, but, again, that begs the question whether the erotic rapture necessarily has to be sexual in nature. For me, it does basically involve sexuality, and I've certainly been within the arms of erotic rapture, if you will, several times in my life, and so I certainly can understand that.
Yeah, I think that's like a fairly, I don't want to say an easy one, because like there are obviously so many different types, and I mean, as you say, like expressions of sexuality, but it's very like tactile. Like it's something that I think the average person, like you say, has experience with, but also like the average person can understand how you can kind of go a little bit deeper in those experiences, and like how even if you yourself have not experienced any sort of erotic rapture as such, like people who have had experiences of eroticism, I think largely know what to look for at the very least, and like what paths they could potentially follow to get there. So yeah, I totally agree with you on that one.
For Plato, the erotic doesn't necessarily involve the bodily per se. It
Mm.
can be a very positive form of eroticism, which elevates the soul to something above and beyond the individual and their own relationship with themselves. Takes them out of themselves and can
Right.
raise them to a level of self-awareness, as well as, I think, cosmic awareness of one's relationship with, again, both oneself and the larger universe, or the cosmos, as it is. You can certainly begin to understand the notion of forces which can control us. I think, at least at the sexual level, these forces can be so strong that they control us, and that can be both positive and negative. You think of the positive as being the great lovers of history, who've been able to show their love and go to extraordinary degrees of exertion for the loved one. And then there's the most base, probably in our culture, which is symbolized by the serial killer, or people who you know enact violence in the throes of some type of erotic rapture or transport.
Right, and I think that like that, and when we've talked before in the past about specifically like sexual mania, erotic mania, and I've said this before, like I really think that your kind of like the intention you're placing upon these sorts of things really matters, because much in the way that like like that violence, that like depravity, I suppose, can be manifested in that sort of erotic mania. Like I always think of it, and I really like that you brought up like the example of the great lovers of history and stuff in this one, because I think that it's a good like illustration of what it is I'm talking about. Because like if you use it, from in my mind anyways, like if it's about connecting with the body, with the material, and like serving your desires, the desires of the material, so to speak, I think that that's where people can kind of get lost in it, right? And it can kind of turn from something that has a great deal of spiritual value into something that not only causes like damage on a spiritual level, but often causes damage in the real world, like in the material. So I think that like if this like moving into discussions of rapture, I think that like if you are going to try to use the erotic to achieve these states, it's going to be really important for you to take a step back and think about like not only why you're doing it, but how you're doing it, and like just keep your intention upon the goal, the end goal, because it's so easy to get lost in it. I think that we all have at one point or another.
Do you see such meditational practices as sexual magic? There's certainly forms of um, Tibetan religious practice, as far as Tantra and other types of erotic, because they're sexual, they can be sexual forms of religious and magical practice. You think that those are positive
Yeah, I mean, like
as
that's
far as?
largely what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? Like those sort of
Sure.
meditative practices, like when you bring the awareness in, I think is like where the value comes from. When it goes from just the activity that you complete to solve your material needs, um, into something that allows like a deeper connection with not only another person, like obviously that's probably the most prominent example of connection that comes from it,
but connection with the greater whole, you know. And I think that, like, in a very basic sense, the sharing of bodies is like an excellent symbol of that interconnectedness of things. And so when I see like those sort of sex magic practices, that's usually how I'm thinking about them, is as a meditation, as ritual, you know what I mean? And I think that that's where the difference lies, is when the act is just the act, then that's where it like falls into materialism. But like, that's not to say that's not positive too. Like, I feel like I'm being like a little bit puritanical here, which is like not what I'm saying, but it's like you just have to recognize the difference in the act and like through the intention you place upon it, I think is my main point. I'm not saying don't have sex for pleasure. That's not what I'm getting at.
Do you think like the act itself, can we maybe desentimentalize it and look at it in terms of purely, if you will, function? I mean, it's functional for a spiritual goal. So let's say for Tantrism, for example, the goal is to use the sexual energy to achieve a certain state of consciousness. Whether I'm attached sentimentally or romantically with my partner, does it matter? I think I've read some tantric texts, or at least some commentaries on tantric texts, where it might not matter as much as we would think in our, in Western society with it, which has been so inundated with romantic notions of love and so on.
Yeah.
And I think sex magic as well, at least as I understand it from Crowley, Aleister Crowley, who, the famous or infamous magician, practiced it. I think the romantic notions were pretty far from his mind when he practiced sex magic.
Yeah. I mean, that's like such a hard question to answer, because like I feel like it theoretically could and probably should be taken out, right? Like if you are acting ritually, your mind should be on the ritual, right? Not the people in the ritual. But
right,
like it's just, that's like, and I think that this is why like sex and sexuality is like such an effective tool in like spiritual and magical exploration, is because people have such a deep and innate connection with it. Like one's sexuality is a big part of their identity, right? Mm-hmm. So on a human level, like I find that very difficult to do. I have a very hard time doing that. And I mean, like,
mm-hmm.
I'm about to get married. I'm like, so it's like very hard for me to separate that from, the greater whole. And that, like, I honestly, that's why, like, though I've like practiced this a bit in the past and like have seen some successes and stuff, especially in like more of a meditative sense, like rather than necessarily a material sense, like gaining material things, like using it as a spiritual meditation. It's not my preferred form of practice, because I have a hard time separating the human out of it. And like that's just going to be like, I think, a personal thing, like what your personality is able to accommodate. And like it can also hurt people too, right? Like in the real world, especially if you're in a partnership and you decide like this is an important part of my practice, like you need to think about what that means for your partnership as well, because there are like definitely some pitfalls that could come in with that, especially if you're practicing in a group. That's just I guess that's pretty obvious to say, but I do think it's worth noting because it's so hard to separate these things.
Right. And the goal has to be uppermost, right? If the goal is somehow a transcendental state, transcendent in the sense that it transcends individuals, transcends egos, transcends any attachments to the world that we might have. That would be paramount, I would think, if one were to practice that type of sex magic or tantric. Now, I personally am like you. I at least I think so. It's hard for me to kind of erase the individual out of that, especially when it comes to my sex partner.
Yeah, totally. And like, it's just
a lot to get intimate, for example.
Definitely. So it's like, yeah, I mean, like, it's not to say, it's just a tough one to use as like your primary form of spiritual expression, I find, it's like, yeah, it's neither here nor there. I think it's a personal thing at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But like, I when you say like taking the ego out of it too, like if you're going to be practicing these sorts of things, again, especially if you're doing it as like part of a group, which is not my experience, but like, personalities and egos are important factors in group dynamics. And if you start bringing in sex to that, I think it makes it even more difficult to, separate yourself and the ego from the act. So like, I would honestly say that and again, I never want to like to give hard and fast advice because people's practice is like so personal to them, but like, you just, I think, have to be like quite evolved to be able to do that in a way that like there are very few people that I know that would be able to do it without allowing ego to like interfere with the point of the act.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, I'm not going to advocate for it, but get me in trouble would take the devil's advocate position. Should it be? I mean, if I'm talking to the Dalai Lama, is the Dalai Lama going to tell me that I should take the ego out of it, that it is not personal in the way that we think in the West, and that the ultimate goal is this? Is it going to be an either or position that the tantrists would take? And should I consider that? I don't know. I mean, I won't, and I think it's a for me it's going to be a personal choice, and I think like you, I'm going to try to find my spiritual expressions in another way that I'm certainly willing to look at the Western romantic view, if you will, maybe not even romantic, maybe even medieval notion of knightly love, or Dante's form of love for Beatrice, as something being akin to the type of spirituality and bringing one to a type of spiritual awareness that perhaps Tantrism would as well.
And again, I'm really bummed that Farzana is not here for this conversation, because I think that's something that I see a lot of, like, at the very least, erotic language used to describe mystical experiences, like, is through Sufic Islam. They have like a very like evocative and beautiful way about speaking with their like encounters with the divine, and it often like does use a lot of that same language of eroticism. So again, I wish she was here to speak a little bit more to that, but it is, I think, worth thinking about. Because like, sorry, go ahead.
Well, the Western mystics do as well, though sometimes, at least from my reading, Western mystics, it almost comes off as a version. Oh, speaking of the devil. Hi, Farzana. Thanks for joining.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, it's Ramadan and I've been a bit...
Oh, Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you. Yeah. So yes. I lost track again. But I thought it was... anyway. So.
We were just talking.
Have you eaten yet? I'm assuming it's dark now.
Yeah, that's right. So we break at sunset, and that was about 3 hours ago.
Okay,
cool.
Right on.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Thank you for joining, Farzana. We've missed you. And, Happy Ramadan.
Thank you. Yeah, going well.
We were in the midst, you kind of caught us kind of with our pants down, so to speak. Not literally,
Sorry,
but
carry on. Carry
not
on.
literally, but rhetorically. We're talking about sexual, manic, erotic mania, as Plato describes it. And he
Okay.
talks about how it's one of the forms of mania which brings us into contact with higher spiritual and cosmic levels of reality. And then we were just talking about the mystics and how they use erotic imagery and iconography in their descriptions of
Yeah.
mystical states and mystical oneness. And I was just on the verge of talking about, well, in the Western tradition, sometimes those descriptions from the saints or from the mystics sound a little bit Freudian, ripe for Freudian interpretation. That because they do repress their sexuality, that it is coming out in very strange and mysterious ways through their mystical visions. I don't know how much people like to believe that Freud was at least relevant in a lot of regards, but there might be something there in this respect.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, go ahead, Farzana.
No, go ahead. You guys.
Well, I was just gonna say, and then I asked the question, given that, because I mean, I'm by no means an expert, but I have heard a lot of that same sort of thing in Sufi text, where there's a lot of that similar language used to describe mystical experience, as would be used to describe, erotic love. So A, am I correct in that interpretation? And B, I'd love to know your thoughts.
I mean, I have looked at Freud a bit, so I'm familiar with his work, and it's actually really interesting because from his perspective, the inner spiritual growth is actually the transformation and the transmutation of the sexual energy. So if it gets trapped in any way, or it gets hindered, or it gets repressed, then there is, quite dramatic repercussions for that. And that's where things like promiscuity and things like that at a younger age are apparent, because it gets thwarted and it gets repressed and misdirected. And it's really interesting that he talks about this energy, because it is the path of inner growth from his context.
I think if you look at his cases, he is going for, a lot of people try to slam him because, he wasn't, some of the interpretations that he made of the empirical data were a little bit outlandish. Maybe he took it too far as interpreting almost everything as sexual. I don't know that that's true per se, because there is also something called the death drive. So at least you have to balance those two. But he did have a lot of empirical experience with individuals who were suffering rather horribly, and a lot of the expression did come out as sexual. And of course, we're talking about the end of the Victorian era, where so much was sexually repressed that you can't imagine, there wasn't any of that type of repression, and you couldn't ascribe some of these maladies, these psychological maladies that people were experiencing, as being sexual in origin. But to kind of put everything down to sexuality per se, at least physical sexuality might be a bit of an extreme. To look at everything that the mystics experienced as purely a result of their sexual repression, I think might be an extreme statement.
Well, little
You know, I
far for
think
me,
that
but
there
again,
was.
that's why that there's 4 types of mania, right? Like, it's not just the mystics don't just speak of erotic
Well,
mania.
that's right.
Yeah.
And not only that, but if you look at, I mean, we're only talking about the bodily expression part of it, right? Is there another part of it, for example, you know, with Platonic love, which seemed to be the type of experience that Plato was ultimately trying to describe, which was the love for an individual, which was not physical and which somehow transcended the physical. That doesn't, I mean, I want to return to what Farzana said, is that if you are repressing your sexual desires, that there will be some type of result from that. I think that's true, personally. I mean, certainly I've seen it in my own life, and I think in other individuals as well.
No, I mean, I'm definitely on board there. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how people can act sometimes when they're not living their best life. But yeah, no, yeah, your point's taken, totally.
I mean, it's
But then
interesting how sorry.
No, good.
No, I was just gonna say, like, when the mystics do describe that moment where you experience divine love, they describe it as ecstasy. So it's very interesting how the terminology that's used is along those lines, because you could say that about the physical aspect of it. Yeah, but they do use words like that.
Yeah, and I think that like that might come from the like we always talk about like the ineffability of the divine, the fact that like words don't really do it justice. And like I think maybe sometimes those like moments of extreme elation where there's like an elevation, you know what I mean? Like the best words we can use to talk about them are things like ecstasy, simply because that is the nature of the English language, you know? So yeah, like I was just wanted a perspective on like, you know, what we what your guys' thoughts were on that. But yeah, then I wanted to bring it back to Chaz, your comment about platonic love, and bring it just like again, like just get your perspective on it, Farzana, because you always talk about God, the one, as like the one that I love, and I
Yeah.
just wanted your perspective on like what does that love mean to you? What does it feel like? What does it look like? You know?
Yeah, I mean, the times that I have experienced something like that, it's not something that I can say has happened a lot, but it has happened, and it does feel like it feels like some kind of like a major release, and then you're expanding and expanding until you kind of tip over the horizon, and then there is kind of no differentiation between you and the one that you love. Like the vastness, you become one with the vastness. So I can understand why they would call it ecstasy, because it does kind of feel like that. And it's the most amazing type of love that I have experienced. And that's why I say he is the one that I love. And that's why I don't spend too much time on the other stuff, because the other stuff haven't really ever got me there. They've always kind of felt like maybe a bit like a distraction,
Right.
you know. And I'm not saying that there isn't steps or, ways, but it is almost like, well, that's not giving me what I'm after, you know. And it does kind of, the experience is very much like that for me, anyway.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, no, that's I again, like you talk about that moment of release, and that's something I've also experienced too. And I think that, like, now that I think about it, maybe that is one of the factors of mania, right? Is release, is that, like, letting go, which does, usually create that. So, like, it's usually the fulcrum for the creation of an ecstatic state, and perhaps the, like, methods. Sorry, Chaz, do you mind just reminding me what the names of the four methods are, or the four?
There's erotic, there's telastic, prophetic, and poetic.
Yes, yeah. And all of these things, like, have, I think, that element of release, which creates the conditions, perhaps, for ecstasy. And it's just, it was like just the language you use there. It's like, it makes it make sense, because all of those things, I think, can be, if you really pull back all of the curtains and look at I don't want to say the facts of the situation, because facts maybe aren't the right word, but, like, the objective truth to you, is like that moment of release causes ecstasy. And I think that that's why we have those words that we use for it. Anyways, that's just my theory, but yeah.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah. Like, I would say, like, the other two, poetic and prophetic, is not something that I've really had a glimpse of. But with prophetic, maybe it can come under various things, like foreseeing things, having an insight into the unseen, knowing like premonitions, what's coming, those kind of things. I have had a little bit of that, but I don't know how that would kind of fit into mania. I mean, it seems like when it
That's it.
becomes too much,
Yeah.
or like
Sorry. Let me
sorry, go ahead.
just. Oh, let me add a little bit of perspective on the word mania. It's
Hmm.
really, that's the way it has been translated, but many people think that it should be translated. The word that Plato uses has been translated as mania for the English, but perhaps the best words are either transport or rapture. So,
That makes sense. Yeah,
because mania does have that type of negative
yeah,
connotation that you're bringing up.
yeah.
So
Rapture
we're
makes more
kind of
sense.
talking
Yeah,
about a transport or rapture, yeah.
yeah. That would make a lot more sense then. But I do think that people that get too much of it, or it's not balanced, or they're not able to contain it, that could lead to actual mania, which is, when the veils are opened like too much, and they can't contain it. That can really lead to difficult things. But the prophetic and the poetic is not something that I can. It sounds a lot like inspiration to me, those particular
Yeah,
ones.
that would be another word for, at least for the poetic, right?
Yeah.
And identifying the differences between those is interesting. Now he does, in this reading that we've had tonight, he's talking about the prophetic.
Uh-huh.
He's talking about the prophetesses at Delphi and Colophon. That is what he's means by prophetic, is being able to go into this transport or this rapture with God. So embraced and enfolded by the God that one loses, at least according to his understanding, and this is Iamblichus's understanding, transported into a realm where time and space don't, all of the restrictions for human beings are removed by the God, so that the prophetess or the prophet can see with the God, into the future, into the past, whatever, into the present, because those limitations of time and space have been removed.
Yeah.
To that point, like, like, reading through the descriptions at Delphi, or of Delphi, there's it's funny because you use the word inspiration to define the poetic, and maybe that's a better way of thinking it. But like, I think that like the defining feature of the prophetic, in at least in my interpretation, is that like it's more of a top-down form of of ecstasy, whereas like the erotic, the poetic, and anyways, doesn't matter. It's like tactile stuff from what I understand.
It's elastic. It
Yeah,
involves
elastic.
it involves the ritual aspects or the
Yeah,
mystery.
exactly. Yeah. So all of these things are ultimately initiated by you through actions in the material. Whether it's through, like love of another, or the sort of like falling into art or ritual action, like all these things are they're you based. They like start with you, whereas the prophetic is a little bit different, at least in my reading, because like the gods speak through, like they come down and they choose to speak through the prophetess, so it's like I almost see that one as like a related but different thing.
He does
a
talk
related but
about
different
preparation,
phenomenon.
though, right? He talks about the water. The one prophetess drinks the water. One prophetess at Delphi sits on the throne, either the 3 or 4-legged throne, and then becomes, transported or goes into rapture. One holds an axle, and we're not exactly sure what that means. Some type of axle-like object, and then goes into the prophetic state as well. So there are some things that seem to be preliminary to being possessed by the god. And he does talk about being purified, right? Talks about that the god possesses you, or can possess you, depending upon your state of purity. The purer you are, the greater the possession by the god. Is one of the things that he's saying. So, of course, this will be the objective of theurgic practice, is to purify oneself so that one can receive the God, or the God, in all full manifestation, if you will.
I find it interesting that, like, just from a historical perspective, and again, you can't really speak to the axle because we don't know what that exactly means, but like the water and the throne, like we know that the throne of Delphi was situated over top like a volcanic vent, which vented psychoactive gases, and like the consumption of.
Let me just sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but that's been disproven. That was disproven in late 1800s.
Okay, all right. I actually was unaware of that.
But however, it does continue to be thought to be true, but it's actually untrue.
Okay, well then
so-called mephitic fumes are not exhaled from the underground volcanic vaults.
Well, I guess that that kind of disproves my
yeah, no, that's fine. I mean,
my thoughts, but like no, what I was just gonna say is like those things I think can be perceived as like in and of themselves the entrance of the gods, right? Like it's a little bit different than ritual, I guess, is like my perspective. But again, if that's not the case, then that's not the case,
Well, I mean, can we make a case, though, like Porphyry does, that these are indeed instances of some type of physical reaction? to something, whether, maybe it is a brain tumor that they had, the prophets had, and, something set off the biological reaction of the brain tumor and sent them into some type of manic rapture. And then they started speaking in tongues. They started reporting seeing these things in another world. They started reporting supposedly prophetic oracles and announcements. Is that a real thing? I think we should take that seriously as a real possibility.
No, I totally agree, actually. So I get a little anecdote to talk about that is when I was in my undergrad. And yeah, I suppose there's no point in not being fully honest about this experience, but I had a rather bad mushrooms trip that really, in which I very much felt an opening of a door to very negative things. And I went to the school chaplain, and that's exactly what she said, is that I believe that these physical reactions that we know can manifest, it's the how, not the why, is the words that she used to describe it. And I always say that now, is the how versus the why. And I think that it makes so much sense, because again, if we talk about sort of the divine architecture of reality, there has to be a how, because it's an architecture. And we know that there are structures in place that underpin reality. And yeah, I think that is just an excellent way to conceive of it if you are thinking about these things and talking about these things, because it really does just provide a new perspective for it.
Well, does that then bring in the use of hallucinogens and other types of so-called drugs, which provide these extraordinary experiences? Are they real? Do you think Iamblichus would? I mean, he kind of talks negatively about the potions and stuff that Porphyry brings up. Should we kind of condemn them as being useful in any type of spiritual adventures? Or can we find an Iamblican, type of interpretation of these experiences and thing that and say, for example, that the, let's say, peyote itself was imbued with the God, as people who do participate with peyote say. They really don't. They ask people not to take peyote without some type of in some type of ritual situation, because it is being disrespectful to the spirit of the peyote.
I mean, I feel like I've made fairly clear, I definitely do feel like it's a completely valid method. And I think that the Iamblichian justification for using these substances in your spiritual practice would kind of, at least I conceive of it as going back to the symbol. A lot of the times, those substances I see as a very potent symbol of the divine on the material plane. And it is through those chemical reactions that it works, yes, but it is because those chemical reactions happen that it is the symbol. So I don't really see any.
Does it mean that there's this other reality, like a god or godlike reality, which is somehow imbuing the chemical with their power? Or is it just the basic physical and the biological reaction to the physical ingredients of the drug that is activating some type of illusory type of experience, which is, who knows, deranging the brain cells to think that something is happening when it's just a manifestation of a physical derangement? Can we say that there is anything divine or spiritual involved at all?
Well, I would
Sorry,
say
go ahead.
I would say to that, like the way that I'm thinking about it is purification. Because if we was to work towards purification, then there would be more of a chance of it being legitimate. Like, yeah, there is a higher being or a great spirit or divine thing that comes into us. And then if you look at hallucinogenics, then we know that it alters the brain and its functions, and that's you can talk about addictions and things like that. I mean, that's where it comes from. The addiction comes from the chemical substance. So that's how I would look at it. Like, to me, if the substance was purified, right, then the person took it, then there's probably more of a chance of there being a real spiritual experience rather than the alteration of the brain chemical. I mean, this is how I think of it, and the reason that I haven't delved into stuff like this, because for me, a lot of these things are also poisonous, right? You got to kind of take that into consideration. But because I am quite sensitive, I would probably have more of a reaction, and I guess it is not something that resonates with me, but I do know that people that have done it for whatever reason they've done it for a spiritual experience, they've actually gained a lot from it, because you will get communications that are actually helpful. So maybe that's why they're doing it, and maybe that's why it is good for them.
I agree with all that. Like, I think that, like, again, like, purification state of mind is critical to, like, have, and it's regardless of whether you're looking for ecstasy in ritual or in substance or through erotic activities, like, that purification is critical. Like, I think you're definitely right to say that. But what I would say to your question, Chaz, is, like, I brought this quote up before, and you corrected me. It's Eckhart, I believe. Lift a stone and God is there, split a piece of wood, and there, like, behold God. If we believe that, then I think it's quite easy to make the next step that these things are somehow, like, blessed. They're somehow imbued with the divine. And if we don't, then it becomes a physical thing. But, like, I do think that it's a matter of faith, this one. And it's like, do we believe God exists in the material? Do we believe that through these structures that exist and that we see, we can find God? And if we say yes, well, then, now we're cooking with gas. Now we can start to explore that. But if we say no, then that's kind of a non-starter. And, like, I mean, I do believe that it is external, that there is something else providing these things, but that is admittedly a matter of faith. Like, and I know that, like, people that are into philosophy don't like to necessarily talk about faith, but I do think that, like, there's a power in the concept.
It's the scientists who don't talk about faith.
Yeah.
Philosophers talk about it all the time.
Yeah, I guess so. Scientists and a lot of occultists like to talk about the occult sciences. You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, like, we do need to make
faith has a bad word. Faith is a bad word these days.
Yeah, it's got, like, bad connotations, but, like, at the end of the day, I do think that that's what it is.
Even though the greatest occultists talk about faith as being the primary virtue and the paramount virtue. For example, Proclus or Bruno even talks about faith, or Agrippa von Nettesheim talks about faith as being primary to any occult practice.
Right. Yeah. So like that's where my perspective comes in on this. And I know this might seem like a flippant answer, but like I do think that like when we're looking at the divine, there is a leap that needs to be taken. And if you take like for me at least, like once I was able to take that leap, that's what opened the door to, you know, being able to, what in my perspective, in my like interpretation, is seeing a fuller picture. That's I would be my answer to that question.
Sure. Let's take a look at page 153. This is one of the passages I was hoping to bring in. I think it fits right into what we're kind of talking about now. At the bottom, well, the last paragraph in chapter 13, the third sentence down. There are some who overlook the whole procedure of effective contemplation, both in regard to the one who makes an invocation and the one who enjoys the vision. And they disdain the order of the sacred observance, its holiness and long protracted endurance of toils, and rejecting the customs, prayers, and other rituals, they believe the simple standing on the characters to be sufficient. And when they have done this for a mere hour, they believe that they have caused some spirit to enter. And yet how could anything noble or perfect result from this? Or how can the eternal and truly existing essence of the gods be united with ephemeral acts in sacred procedures? Hence, because of these things, such rash men go wholly astray, and are not worthy to be counted among diviners. So it seems that he's definitely saying that the whole procedure, everything that we talk about as ritual and ritual observance, is required for such occult practices to actually take effect. He's talking about here in this specific reading, he talks about the standing on the characters, which is similar to what presentation you gave a while ago, Brian, which has to do with sigils. He's standing on the characters is basically what they would do is they would draw these characters, I guess, in the sand and then stand on them with the characters. Were very similar to what you call sigils. But here he's saying that in order for these to be, for any ritual related to the sigils to be effective, you have to perform all of the parts of the ritual that are required. They include even some types of endurance trials, it seems. You know, there have to be some types of what he calls long protracted endurance of toils. So there does seem to be some type of, renunciation required as well.
And this is kind of another tangent, but like when I started doing these readings, and like from my like knowledge of Iamblichus, Porphyry, Plotinus, I found myself gravitating very heavily towards the Iamblichian perspective, because I practice ritual. And it's like an excellent framework to place that on. But when I see things like this, it's clear that Iamblichus has like, well, I'll put it this way, like a much higher standard of ritual than I do. And I've just found it like myself in a lot of cases when I like hear these things, agreeing more with Porphyry, which I really didn't at the start of the course. So I'm like, I've just, on a personal note, that growth, like the development in my thoughts has been like very interesting and nice because like, well, to be frank, like Iamblichus has the standards of a priest, right? In his kind of like ritual conception. And I guess like, I'm not a priestly man, you know what I mean? Like, I that's not how I live my life a lot of the times. But I still have had valid experience, you know.
But you were just
Yeah, but like,
talking about the need for ritual, which weren't
no,
you?
and I'm not like, yeah, no, I'm not that, but like it's just like the occult elitism that I see in Iamblichus is very evocative of a certain way of thinking in like modern occult communities that I tend to disdain. Like I practice ritual, but like I'm also just more I don't know, like understanding of like various perspectives. Like Iamblichus does seem to be quite dogmatic at the end of the day, which is interesting because I didn't perceive him as dogmatic in the beginning, which I guess is like my main point. So just like an interesting comment. Yeah.
You know, I think you're right about the priestly aspect of his teachings, and remember that they were in competition with like another priestly tradition, which was Christianity, right? I mean, he and Porphyry were in direct competition with Saint Augustine, for example, the great, well, if you want to call him great, organizers of the Christian monastic tradition. So it's certainly monastic and monastic priestly in that sense. I think that the competition that was going, there was competition going on about who could be more priestly, who could be, you know, purer, who could show their ability to somehow withstand all of these types of earthly temptations. I think there was that kind of thing. You know, that Christianity.
Like there's like a piety Olympics going on.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Christianity, and especially the monastic tradition, was touting itself as being closer to God because it was less affiliated or less concerned with the earthly.
Right. Yeah. Now, again, I don't know if that's either here nor there, but I just found it really interesting reading that passage.
Can it go to an extreme, though, with the non-ritual aspects of things? I mean,
I think definitely, yeah.
I mean, it seems, and I keep going back to this question I asked one time, and I believe it was the occult channel on Reddit. Do you need to, do you need to perhaps abstain from sex for a day or several days? Do you need to be ritually cleansed to participate in any of these rituals? And the one person replied, why? I never do. Maybe I'll wash my hands, which is one thing. But that seems a little bit of a nonchalant way of approaching these things. And should we have a little bit more of this awe and fear and trembling approach to these rituals and to these practices?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
sorry, Farzana, we can't hear you.
Oh no, I was just going to say that, like in our tradition, there is something called an ablution. I think we did. I mentioned it before. Before we would do the prayers, we would do an ablution. And I don't know what. I think there was a similar practice in Christianity, but they called it something else. I can't remember now. But then the meaning of it means that, like, illumined, like you illuminate certain areas of your body because you're about to approach the King of Kings, the master of the universe, right? So there is this kind of reverence that you would bring to that because you know who you're approaching. And, to me, that kind of sits. It sits well. It's nice. And I think that, I would feel a little bit like, I mean, we can't actually pray without the ablution, but it's like, what if I was to approach it? I mean, I think by the time we're like young children, it's kind of conditioned in us to make sure we've got the ablution before the prayer. But it's like, if I think about it and I say, Well, what if I don't do that? Well, there are exceptions, meaning it's not a one-way thing, meaning that if you're ill or you're sick or you can't get to water, you can use earth. And if I have a look at it, it kind of it makes sense, because I think what would happen with you rubbing these elements on the body is that it charges them. So, it helps with the elevation. This is my experience anyway. I do find that, when I rub earth and something that has quite a strong magnetic field in its earthly element, it certainly does something. Like, it's much more effective. So there does seem to be that aspect of it, but there also is a reverence aspect of it.
Mhm.
So although I think that, it can go on to dogmatism. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I see that everywhere. And it's really annoying because you're just told this is the way and, this is how it should be. And, you don't look elsewhere. And it's like, well, actually, there is flexibility, right? Meaning that if you didn't do it, can you still go ahead with the ritual or the prayer or whatever it is? And I think, yeah, why not? At the end of the day, is it essential? I mean, for me, it's essential, but that's because it was ingrained in me that way. But ultimately, is it essential? I don't think God works like that. You approach him, you come to him, you do the rituals, and he's there for you. It really does feel like that. And one thing that I would say about Iamblichus is that I think there's a difference between, like, when I talk about other religions and there is dogmatism there, and the way that Iamblichus presents a lot of his work. And I think what I recognize as the difference is that Iamblichus had true knowledge, meaning he was able to see this stuff. Other people can't. They can't see it. He could probably see the higher world.
Yep.
I don't know, but this is just my take on it. He could probably see the higher dimensions. He could probably witness all of it and come back with all the descriptions.
Yep.
And it may be quite accurate. And that's just the feeling that I get from his work.
I'm with you. I think it comes across as being kind of dry, a little bit dry and descriptive, whereas he's describing real things that he's seen. If you kind of look behind just the dryness, you're saying, wow, this guy was actually experiencing gods and goddesses and these other realities.
Yeah, it's like he wasn't delusional to that, because there is an element of delusion here. You have to bring that into the equation, and then you yourself have to get a feel for it, because there are lots of things that seem a bit delusional. Some things that I read and I'm like, well, I don't really, I'm not really seeing that. But fair enough, that might be the case. But he doesn't seem to have this aspect to him. He seems to be very sound of mind.
Yeah, very sober.
He's
not despite the fact that I think he leans into dogmatism, he's definitely not a proselytizer as such. Though this is ultimately a proselytizing work, but not in the same way that you think of an evangelical proselytizer, where it's it is based in ecstasy. I think a lot of the times it's based in passions and emotions, whereas he has this very systematic and almost academic, I think is probably a good way to talk about it, approach to thinking about these things. And I think some of that probably comes from culture, right? The Greek sort of patrician or Greco-Roman patrician culture had that sort of academic leaning, especially in philosophy. But it's you're right. It's interesting to note that the analysis he presents doesn't have at least in the same way, those very ecstatic descriptions. It's very it's almost anthropological, right?
Yeah, and he seems quite stoic, and he seems quite he's got a good foundation, and he's not, speaking from, a place of emotions or a mind that just wanders. you can tell these type of qualities. I mean, not that I agree with every single thing these type of people speak about, because I have to confirm certain things with my own experience, and then I also have to see things for myself. Okay, great, you said this, but I'm not so convinced, and I've got to see that for myself. And once I see it for myself, then I know. I'm never going to know if you're just telling me. So that's why I don't take everything. It's never 100% for me.
Yeah. I mean, same. Yeah, I'm a cafeteria occultist at the end of the day, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to accuse you of that. I'm glad you own up to it.
Yeah, no, it's very much true. Like, it's like such a personal thing for me. You know what I mean? I am allergic to dogma, kind of at my core. Like, I've told you guys about my like kind of journey where like I did have that like atheist bent in me when I was like a lot younger, and like that was because of a rejection of dogma. You know what I mean? And like from there, it's been a point of like kind of learning and creating my own understanding of things through others, and like knowing that like my interpretation will be different. And yeah, so thank you for keeping me honest.
That's an interesting approach, and I think we can end on that end in the sense that we'll end this session, but we can take up these questions in the next session. Those are interesting points about dogma and about Iamblichus as being talking about real stuff here, and that he is reporting through very, as you put it, stoic, Farzana, that's a great word, stoic words and interpretation, but he is presenting something that he himself has experienced. Yeah, let's continue with that discussion in the next episode of the Iamblichus Reading Group. And until next time, we'll talk. See you then. Thanks to all who joined us for the March 14th episode of the Iamblichus Reading Group. We hope you enjoyed the discussions as much as we did. We are grateful for all the support you show us. Now take that next step and leave us a comment on YouTube with your thoughts about the topics we discussed, either in this episode or any of our other episodes. Again, thanks for listening. And until next time, may the gods favor all that you do. This is Chaz signing off until next time.